All right, we are live. Cool. Well, welcome everybody. This is a litgeeks hangout for Chapter 6 on the history of the phenomena of soul and spirit. And I didn't even really finish reading this, but I did go through the whole chapter to try to review everything. And as we've been talking about before we started the recording, it's a very, very dense, convoluted kind of chapter. There's so much information he's packing in here about symbols and talking about soul, talking about the origins of soul, and he goes through language, he goes through certain mythic images, and we were mentioning how it's almost like a Carl Jung read or a Joseph Campbell read, and how just packed it is with all this information. And the question is sort of like, what was he doing in this chapter? What was his intention? Maybe we can kind of begin there. What our reaction was. For me, it was I more than anything, because he's talking about methodology in the beginning, but also at the end, sort of like the tail end, the very last paragraph, he's talking about how important it is to really concretize the structures, and in this case, to really concretize myth and magic and numinosity of the soul and spirit. And I think if I understand what he was trying to do as a whole, he really just wanted us to experience this as a lived reality. And I think that's why very frequently throughout this chapter, there's so much emphasis that don't just take this lightly, but also don't take it too seriously and don't become overtaken by the sea and of the sea of the soul. Right? He uses the imagery of the sea to associate with the soul, or in Henry Corbin's language, the mundus imaginalis. But I think he's trying to say that this is real, this is a reality, and it's not non-quantifiable. And to really confront that in us and in ourselves is extremely important. So let's do that as carefully as we can. And by doing that, I guess the last point I have, my impression was, by doing this, by really coming to encounter the soul, encounter the numinous in this chapter in ourselves, we can differentiate that from this integral or this emergent structure. So we're not just kind of reiterating things. So we're not just kind of playing into these powers that are in us and that possess us, but actually are able to kind of navigate through that and not just be subjected to it. Which he mentions Jung, he mentions a couple of other psychologists, and he's trying to disentangle this emergent structure from all of these things that are interesting in the 20th century, that revival of interest in these things, including parapsychology, which he takes seriously in this chapter, is interesting, in the occult. But he's saying this is a lived reality. Let's come in contact with it so we can understand that the emergent consciousness is not just this aspect of us. But then also understanding that this part of us, the numinous, the magic, the mythic, is part of some greater spiritual thing, which is got a little confusing, because right at the end he's talking about spirit and spirits and the sort of movement into perspectivity and the evolution of like the Holy Spirit and that kind of thing. But he says it's not just that. There's also this thing called the spiritual, which is all of these things. He seems to be using it synonymously with talking about origin, this integral structure. So I thought that would be good to just kind of point out too. There's a couple of different things he's doing here. So that's how I made sense of the chapter. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in and just give their initial impressions, reactions, and what do you think Gebser's trying to do here? I guess we're all kind of...
Well, I'll chime in. I think you came onto the same key that I did, because I had the same question. What's this about? Like, why are we going into all these complicated, very nuanced, very dense details about the way that soul was kind of came into being or sourced, or its sort of initial manifestations, and how that's different than spirit, and what are the poles between them. There's a whole bunch of stuff we could talk about there, but at the very end, like you pointed out, he turned the conversation to this, what he called the spiritual. And my mind went back to the first chapter, page 5, where he's saying that spiritual reality in its intensified form is also becoming effectual and real. Spiritual reality. And he's talking here about the integral structure, the emergent integral structure. So what I think he's doing in this later chapter, in this whole discussion of soul and spirit, I'm hearing myself echo, so it's a little bit, somebody might have an echo on their, that's better. Is kind of what he's doing in all the other chapters. Everything in part 1. It's like if he's doing a sculpture, he's kind of defining the negative space. He's kind of cutting everything off of what the sculpture is going to be. So it's like a neti, not this, not that, and it's not those things, but just like in this kind of mythical polarity type of thinking, it is those things as well. Because these are manifestations of it. So soul is a manifestation of the spiritual. Spirit is a manifestation of the spiritual. And then what I expect is that in the next part, we focus on the positive aspect of the integral structure. And one of the parts of that is the spiritual. And I don't know, I haven't gotten there yet. Others have read the book before, and so you may know what's coming there. But that's the sense that I got. And again, we get this sort of warning, this caveat that he gives, or it's more than a caveat. It's some kind of like caution that he gives. You mentioned this as well, Jeremy, where he says that we're dealing with like dangerous forces. Like there's some sense of dealing with dangerous forces, and not just in general in the abstract, but he seems, it's a weird thing. I don't know what to really make of this, but he seems to say that even just writing about it, somehow carries the risk of plunging yourself into this, realm from which you might not be able to escape. It's the immeasurable, imaginal realm, and then he gives the other potential of this forward escape into the expanses of transcendentalism. And so it's like we're navigating this narrow, zigzagging path, to do this work of disentangling, of teasing apart, of like turning around and seeing the different facets of, like, and just carefully examine the ideas that we've inherited. And I think the purpose of that, again, is to start to clear the space for something new. But I think, as readers, in this phase of the book, we're sort of in that dark before the dawn. We're seeing all the negative space, as it were, not negative in a bad way, but just negative in the sense of it's not that, and getting intimations of and promises of the positive, the integral, but not yet fully seeing it. Like as readers through this book, we may have our own ideas about it, but insofar as we're taking a journey into this book, I think we're in this sort of this twilight moment. He uses that term as well, sort of darkness going into the light, but not yet there.
Yeah, I like your point, Mirko, about sort of this via negativa approach. By doing that, it's rereading it now in a kind of linear fashion. The narrative is interesting because before you can really kind of dive into this integral, all of these other structures are instead kind of coming online in you as you read. You're just kind of thinking about what he means about language, and you're thinking about the implications in modern media and the way you grew up and the way you experience these kinds of forms of perspectivity or unperspectivity. So it's kind of fun in that sense. It's arduous, but it's also kind of deeply immersive. And then he's like, all right, before we get to this new thing, we're going to really submerge into these structures. We're really going to make you, they're not just going to be structures. They're going to be lived realities, lived intensities. And before we can get to this emergent intensity, we can peek at it, and he'll keep kind of hinting at it a little bit in the first book, in the first section. And he'll hint at it, but he'll keep bringing us back into these older structures. And I guess I appreciate it. It's a little arduous because it's just like, it's so careful. He's not going to give you the good stuff right away. But on the other hand, I guess he's a kind of a cautious thinker in his own right. And maybe this is more of his personality, that he's kind of like, well, really, we really need to distinguish it. We really need to, like you're saying, disentangle it before we can talk about it in a way in which we've at least carefully noted that these are other realities, these are other dimensionalities, and it isn't these things specifically. But he does mention a couple interesting things just, halfway through, or was it halfway through? Yeah, about halfway through this chapter, on like page 204. He's talking a little bit about the structures of consciousness as a whole. He kind of moves out of talking about the soul, and he mentions a little bit, and I've heard this used before, kind of as a sort of interesting counterpoint to Jung. But he suggests that there is no such thing as, there is no so-called unconscious. There are only various modalities or intensities of consciousness. And he talks about, one-dimensional magic, two-dimensional myth, three-dimensional mental. And then he says there will also be an integral fourth-dimensional consciousness of the whole. And he made an interesting point here that I thought was it helped tie in what he was talking about at the beginning of this whole book. And he says this immanent four-dimensional consciousness is the original zero-dimensional consciousness as such. So, saying whatever is coming out is the original. It's like it's the whole. It's before the archaic even. It's like this wholeness. So that was very interesting to kind of throw that in here. And then later on this page, he talks about this integrative capacity of consciousness. And he's kind of defining it. The consciousness is the ability to survey those interconnections which constitute us. And I think he's talking about the structures. And then later he says consciousness, because it is bound to both the ego and the itself, I guess he's talking about consciousness itself, is the intensity capable of integrating mutations in their entirety in man. So just kind of an interesting caveat here. He's kind of going into the way he's understanding how this all fits together before he dives right back into the particularities of soul and the death pole and the life pole of soul. But before he does that, he has an interesting little statement here. I'm probably going to try to revisit this. I don't know if anybody was struck by this section as well. But yeah, does anyone else want to chime in? And anything particularly interesting about this chapter for you? Or confusing, maybe? There are a couple of notes on the soul and the polarity and the image of the bird that I want to get to, but before I keep rambling, anybody else who wants to chime in? Maybe Peter or Kim? Or
well, I have a very mundane question. Right in the beginning of the chapter, he talks about soul and he talks about psyche, and I can't decide whether he means those to be synonyms or there's some difference, and if there's a difference, I can't discern it. I was wondering if anybody wanted to comment on that.
That's a good point, because he uses this elsewhere in the book, too. He mentions psyche, and I don't know if he's referring to soul or not, even though psyche means soul.
But I always thought it did.
Yeah, and Jung uses that as well, as synonymous with soul. So I would just assume that he is making that connection. I wouldn't think that he's trying to disentangle it, but maybe. I know he's had some cautions around psychology and Jungian psychology. It's a kind of mythical superstructure he describes it as. But I don't really think there's much of a differentiation. If there's anything, there's just the caveat that within soul there's also sort of spirits and the numinous and mana and these kind of magical structure as well as the mythical comprise the soul. And I think that's the only thing that's interesting, that he's adding maybe to Jung by making that differentiation, by not just talking about soul but also saying, the magical structure of mana and powers and that kind of thing is also an aspect of it. So,
Well,
In the index,
go ahead, Doug.
in the index, he uses the alternate synonym in brackets. So it's psyche in brackets soul and soul in brackets psyche in the index of the book.
interesting. Thank you, Dad.
My reading is that he was distinguishing them, and that he meant psyche more broadly than soul. The understanding I had was that psyche is just kind of the broadest realm of phenomena that would occur in our interior life. So dreams, images, sounds, including stories, narrative, and then kind of leading into the mental, but not yet leading into the mental, maybe bleeding into it. I mean, still operative in it, really, but at that point becoming sort of differentiated, where the mental actually can construct spaces. The psyche is unbounded, is one thing that he says. It doesn't have boundaries. It can just kind of go infinitely. It could keep on kind of looping around itself. It doesn't contain things in indefinite statements, the way that a rational understanding would want to say, okay, the life pole is either water or it's air. You have to choose one or the other. Well, for the soul and for the psyche, it really kind of just gets mixed up, and it's much less well defined. And so then I thought that within psyche, soul is one particular kind of expression of that. I mean, it's a curious thing. Like, what is soul? We think of it now, in the wake of Christianity and in the wake of modernity as one thing, a unitary thing that corresponds to an individual person. But in this chapter, he gives examples of societies that would recognize many souls within one person. And then souls that are not just living, but also souls that are dead. So souls in the life world, and then souls also in the death world. And it seems to me like all those different souls, all those different particular expressions of energies, vital energies, he also calls them, occur within the realm of the psyche, the sphere of the psyche, the sphere of the psyche. On page 189, he is talking about his intentions for the chapter, and he says that it is also our desire to clarify the extent and nature of the effects of the psyche, and to examine the possibility of an apsychic world. That is, a world freed from the dependence on or enslavement to the psyche, in which the psyche is, in consequence, not negated, but rather becomes transparent. So that was an interesting idea, I think, this idea of an apsychic world. I never really even conceived of that before. That whole, that you wouldn't you wouldn't have an interior life that's distinguished from an exterior life. Like, I think he's kind of getting to a sort of non-duality. But I'll stop there. I mean, I'm curious. Like, maybe that's an interesting way to go. Like, what, we all. I think part of maybe what brings us together as a group, there is sort of psychic quality to it. Like, how do you get attracted to other people? How do you kind of gravitate towards something? I've experienced these correspondences and these synchronicities and that kind of a thing, and so we have this psychic, I think, quality that we experience, at least, right? And he's sort of arguing, I think, that there's something beyond that. There's something beyond even, like, say, a panpsychism. He refers to psychists as a philosophical school. But I don't know exactly what that means. It was an intriguing part to me.
Yeah, it's definitely very. Please, anybody who wants to chime in, please do. But
I just make an observation that I think, and this is just maybe a modern connotation or my particular hearing of it, but I think the word psyche gets used when you're talking about psychology or some kind of therapeutic modality or something like that. And I hear the word soul in religious language. So I don't know if that's a real difference or if that's just how people start using the word or what. But I mean, I just noticed that, so I don't know what to make of that.
I feel like, can you guys all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a part way earlier on where he talks about how the mutational process is not a biological process, but it's a spiritual process. And so maybe he's using soul in a sort of sense of spirituality, but when he described what that spirituality was, it wasn't necessarily religious from what it sounded like. It was more of like just an overall sense of unity, perhaps, or desire for unity within our psyche and whatever. Again, we're still seeming to try to define psyche here. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful or anything. Gives anyone any ideas?
I just jumped in, and I found that it took me like I'm actually just getting to understand his terminology, which makes like me having to do this like backward propagating over the reading, and like, oh shit, like he's talking about this, and I've been like imposing my own meaning on it, which has created all this confusion that is now like starting to clarify this week. And part of what's going on, I think, is when he's talking about psyche and soul, to me, he's just talking about the imagistic or the imaginal aspects of our consciousness. And soul, then, on the other side, is that which sees the images. So it's like the body of the psyche. And with spirit, though, spirit is like the diaphany, from my understanding. Spirit's not attached to psyche or soul, but is the like ground from which all arises from and falls back into. So that's my understanding so far of what he's getting at. And of course, I mean, it could be completely wrong by the time I get to the end of the book.
You know, a lot of the mystical religious traditions talk about a kind of unity that I don't think Gebser's really mentioning when he's talking about mythic unity or unity of the polarities or the complementarity of yin and yang that he describes in this chapter, because he's very careful to say that unity can't be what we think it is in terms of like the whole, because it has to do with this mythic polarity. So where there's a unity, there's going to be an anti. He said something like that. I didn't quite get what he was saying about that, but in a lot of the mystical traditions, it's interesting. He mentions D.T. Suzuki here. A couple of, I'm trying to see if I can find the page, but he mentions D.T. Suzuki, and he also mentions Jacob Boehme as somebody who kind of concretized his experience, and he's talking about this necessity of conscious integration. But he talks about Suzuki in Zen Buddhism, and Satori is a form of irrational integral. And I have to go find what he specifically meant by that. But I think it's interesting because he's saying basically that within religious traditions, within the kind of mythic-oriented sort of mythical and magical pre-secular consciousness of modernity, there was an ability to to see into the whole, into this kind of spiritual origin and spiritual present. So he doesn't seem to think that it's incapable of being accessed within the religious consciousness. It's just a very particular thing. He's trying to distinguish it from other aspects of unity and things like polarity and things like that. But yeah, the language gets a little tricky because we have spirit, we have the spiritual, we have spirits, we have soul, we have psyche. So we're trying to navigate all of this language, and I think that's probably why this chapter was just so convoluted in some sense, because there's just so much to distinguish and parse through, and then you have to kind of hold that all in your mind going forward. But
don't forget numinosum.
Oh yes.
That was sort of the big, nugget of a word
yeah.
threw in there.
That's very true. Yeah, and again, like I think the thing is, he really wants us to experience it, and he keeps saying like, but don't get carried away by it. I really feel like there's this comic book called Promethea by Alan Moore, and there's a section where this Promethea character goes into basically the imaginal world, and everything in the imaginal world by this character's experience is this kind of hyper reality. Everything is just infused with this numinosity that almost makes it eternal. And so she's sort of wandering through this forest, and she meets like the wolf from the fairy tale of Red Riding Hood, and it's beautifully drawn, and it's just like this massive, intricate, like almost deity, and it just has this like super reality to it, and then she's just so overwhelmed and not entranced necessarily, but just overwhelmed by it in like a completely totalizing sense, and she has to kind of escape from it. And I feel like he's kind of saying, if you allow these things their due, they have this kind of power, and I think the attractiveness of this is that, these things are sometimes, they have more intensity to them. They have more intensity than the mental, than the waking. And I think with a lot of like the romanticist-oriented like revivals and mythic revival and the interest in myth in the 20th century, we kind of rediscovered these things as valid realities, and in some sense we want to bring them back and integrate them and see their usefulness and just their existence and acknowledge them. And I think he's just trying to acknowledge that as much as he can and say that that's not the whole. That's a part of who we are, and so is the mental wakefulness, and neither of them are this integral thing, which isn't a thing. So I just think it's interesting how he's kind of trying to really distinguish this and be very careful. I think the carefulness has a point. And yeah, right at the beginning, you're talking about a world freed from dependence on the enslavement to the psyche. And it's kind of a little bit of strong language, because the psyche isn't going to go away with this integral, the spiritual is just going to be part of the whole. So I think it's kind of, I'm going to stop rambling, but it's interesting. It's that tension I'm noticing in the writing. So.
Maybe I could throw out a question that's like more, just kind of gets more direct into things, and going off Jeremy, I think the passage one of the passages you refer to in your ramble is that he talks about the numinosa and relates it to the word for numen and vital experience, and then does a little etymology and connects it to holiness and healing and wholeness, and then finally gets to this sense of trembling, this sense of like this fear and trembling before something that's completely other, like an energy that's completely other, an entity that's that's other, and how that's one of the aspects of the confrontation, the relationship with the psyche, and with the numinosa, with that sort of heart of the psychical reality. So, do you feel that? Does anybody feel that? Like, is that just something that he's? Is that just a quirk of Jean Gebser? That you wouldn't find a similar kind of like warning in a lot of other integral thinkers. Like it's just a little bit more breezy. There's less of a sense of like the impending danger of something. Do you feel that sense? Do you feel a sense of, I don't know, danger before the psyche, the magical, the mythical, like these structures that he's evoking?
I wouldn't call them dangerous. I would just call them powerful. And to the degree to which other integral thinkers aren't taking them seriously or are being condescending about, like, well, the earlier magical thinking that to solve the world with their imagination, those were great times. So naive, so protected by the bubble of, like, that to me is just, that's not, it's not actually being in touch with the actual structure. It's kind of being, arrogant from the mental perspective. So, and I think that's why he's probably so hyper cautious.
I think there's I don't know about other integral thinkers, but from my own experience, reading his warnings about the magic and the mythical, his caution echoes my own, not my explorations particularly, but like watching other people explore these areas and getting like consumed by them, especially like occultist and magical practice, like people I know just like almost, some people are completely losing their minds, like literally. So I think there is some danger there and some caution that should be exercised when dredging these powerful forces back up from the depths.
I completely agree with that. I just want to say, like, I see that as well in the possibility of getting consumed in another one of the mutations, and that's the sort of the need for an integration, right? Is so that we don't fall prey to being trapped in just one mutation, whether that's the perspectivity of the mental world or, like, this egoless world of a magical time. I get really frustrated sometimes when I hear these sort of new age teachers saying, get rid of your ego, just let it go, like it's a bad thing to have an ego. And I think that when we're really looking at becoming integrated and to that awareness that, say, these yogis and people are trying to promote by saying get rid of your ego, they're not saying it in the sense of wholeness that is required by the integral consciousness, to where we're not getting rid of the ego, we're just becoming free of it, free of the deficient manifestations of it, perhaps, hopefully, I guess. Yeah.
Carl Jung had a great, he talked about this a lot, especially with the creation of his Red Book, which was precipitated by a series of just sort of mental breakdowns where he thought he was just going mad. And he was having these sort of waking hallucinatory visions and emotions, and just all of this experience overcame him, which he had to channel into this creative work, the Red Book. But I think Jung is a good example here as somebody who worked so much with this aspect of who we are, so much with the psyche, and spoke quite often of how careful you have to be not to allow your conscious waking self to be totally eliminated by it, but to develop a relationship with it. In many ways, I think the modern person is almost like interacting with these forces in a way like it's frozen over. We don't have direct contact with it anymore in a conscious way, and it's almost like a frozen lake or ice over the waters, and we're kind of poking these holes into these depths, discovering things that are just kind of overwhelming to us. But I think we do have to be careful, and I think Jung led a good example by trying to channel those forces and those energies in a creative way, and thereby kind of allow them to be almost like what do you call it, like a transistor, where there's too much charge and you have to kind of lower that charge to allow the energy to come through for your electronics. It's kind of like that, I feel. I see we have somebody new on, Nicholas.
Yes, hi.
Hey, Nicholas. I don't think you've joined us before, right?
No, I was on last week. It's
you
usually for me to join in the evenings. This week I couldn't make Tuesday, so I came on Thursday. I met you, Jeremy, about a year ago back at the conference in New York.
Oh, wonderful. Good to see you again. I can't quite see you. You're a little bit further away. It looks like your camera's a little fuzzy, but I hear you.
Yeah, probably the camera is rarely used, so maybe, I don't know, some...
Not a problem.
You look vaguely numinous.
It needs cleaning. Yeah, well, at this hour of the night, the lamp in my office looks like a lightning bolt or something.
Well, welcome again, and so
Yeah, I don't know if I should be scared or not. I don't know how seriously to take some of the warnings. I know that it's true. People go mad, people become obsessed. Certainly, look around and there's a certain madness. There's a certain psychosis that is taken hold of the world, and like a terrorist attack, for example. It's just like this rupture of, very dangerous, magic, mythical type of energy, right? That could happen anywhere, pretty much. I could take a bus and boom. So it's like the sense of that it's sort of, like exploding around us and like bubbling up in different places and chaotic and unpredictable. And so I think that's all perhaps implied, and I think we have to keep going back to the fact that he's writing just after the World War, and he's barely escaped death himself a couple of times in the last number of years. So extremely sobering circumstances, I think, for a thinking person, and I think that seriousness is reflected in his writing. Maybe I think a lot has happened since then, and there have been whole cultural revolution basically since that time, and so we have a different relationship maybe to things. Like I think maybe we're more relaxed, I think, with the imagination, with the just play of things, and just through our movies, our advertisements. I mean, everything is kind of, a lot of our media is sort of designed to make us feel relaxed about the world in some way or the other. That's, I think, it's part of its narcotic quality. That's part of its addictive quality. And so we become, in a sense, like we kind of have this normalization of the destructive powers that are around us, where they're kind of dramatized, and we relate to them as almost reality TV. So it's, I mean, I think we have to also respect the different times that we're encountering him in, and this is his particular way into understanding what's going on, and he kind of sets an example for us, I think, but we still have to find our own way to it. Like I think we still have to find our own way to that sort of authentic, like, holy shit, this is what what I thought was actually going on, what I thought I actually had control over, or what it was not actually under my control. It was not actually happening. It wasn't actually the case. I mean, I can say for sure, like, if like I thought I have an idea of what integral is, like I had that just bias, I had that prejudice. I've been reading, integral thinkers for a long time, read Wilbur, I co-wrote a book about it, and then if you think, well, how much of what you think is integral or what you think is spiritual is actually just these kind of mutant manifestations of something that you really haven't understood. You really haven't integrated, actually. And so I'm like questioning myself, like, what have I actually integrated? Like, what's still like, like a threat, to me? What's still? Kim, you're laughing. I think that obligates you to respond.
It's a very personal question, Marco, to ask to the group about you. But I guess let me ask you a question in terms of where you're at in the reading right now, and has it affected or impacted your understanding or experience of what integral is?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Personally?
Yeah.
it hasn't given me like a new idea, really. You know, it's like I don't have a new idea of what it is. It's such a fraught term, honestly. We have a whole thread on the discussion forum, like what does integral mean to you, and I think that we can sort of see it in positive, just abstractly, and kind of have our ideal version of what integral means. And you know, that's out there. You know, there's different ideal versions of what that means. And then it's like, but are you actually integrated, or are you actually integral? Like, do you know that experientially? That's one of the things he talks about here as well, is like the difference between a conceptual type of understanding, a mental understanding, and an experiential understanding, like really knowing, right? And he gets even into like, what does knowing mean? Like, what are the different resonances of that? So, you know, I think that you know, I'm not a great person to ask about that necessarily, because I still feel kind of caught in the cultural, sort of the more contemporary cultural debates around integral and specific integral community issues and that kind of a thing.
Right, but I mean, specifically in response to what you've read here, has this impacted or affected you in any way in terms of your relationship to how you think of yourself as integral? So sort of asking your question back to you, do you notice a difference?
I think that I know less what that means, if that makes sense. And I think that I'm wondering, like, what am I not aware of? You know, what am I not actually even seeing or getting about who I am, or about like what's within me? You know, like what's sort of like under the surface that I'm not paying attention to, or that I'm not, you know, at ease with, you know, that I'm not seeing through, that's not transparent.
I mean, I kind of want to go to, I think Jeremy put a post on Facebook a couple days ago about his own experience of reading this, so I kind of want to ask him that same question in terms of where we're at in the book right now, because he keeps kind of like going, for me, in more depth into these, you know, the magic and mythic kind of, just really in a lot of, like you guys mentioned, caution. And I have to tell you, I had a little bit of anxiety when I was first reading earlier on, when he started warning about, you know, even wanting to talk about examples from the magic structure. And I have felt a little bit of curiosity as to like why he would keep doing that, and I think I have, at least for myself, a sensibility in terms of why, and where that's impacted even my sensitivity in relating to people in the day-to-day, in terms of how I listen, and for my intuitive sense, how I'm being informed on my own connection with the people I'm interacting with. So I have a greater sensitivity to where people themselves are actually vulnerable or exposed to forces in their own place right in that moment where they're at. And I think a better sensibility and visibility into the delicate nature actually, and the construct of like where we're at developmentally, like each individual I'm interacting with. And I got really one of the integral people in our community here. Everyone thinks he's absolutely insane, and he is. He's a complete asshole, but he was kind of trying to point to something for me in my own sensibility in terms of where I function at, being sensitive to other people, that I didn't really understand until reading this book. But he accused me of being kind of like doing subtle work with people when I was interacting with them in a very sort of haphazard, playful way, and which I'm sort of aware of because I'm kind of like getting information and just kind of playing with it, and then just being very intuitive with how I interact with people, or was at that time. And I think reading this book for me has made me a lot more disciplined and sensitive. And ironically, reading Brene Brown at the same time has actually like really grounded that for me in a very concrete sort of research-based, rational sense of compassion. And so for me, it's mapping over these sensibilities and these sensitivities that I don't know if it's more just how I'm wired or what I'm sensitive to. I tend to kind of bias I have a lot of reasons. You know, he kind of talks about too developmentally where in our own human development, some of these structures kind of will be more kind of present or part of that maybe earlier on, like when we're babies and stuff like that. And my developmental history has been kind of like an atypical sort of developmental cycle to like most people. So me and my brother guesses that my nervous system just had a slightly different orientation. So I went through stages of my nervous system development later on than most people would have, just based on where I spent my first year of life. So I don't know if that's kind of giving me an atypical experience of, you know, like he talks about auras in here around the mythic, and he talks about those types of things where it's like, I think Lauren was talking about earlier, I mean, how annoying it is to interact with new age people. I remember when I went to yoga teacher training, and I will get to a point here, when I went to yoga teacher training, I remember I had some sensitivities and awarenesses that kind of came out of doing my yoga practice, and when I looked for people to ask about what that meant, asking that question about seeing light was not the greatest place in the world to do that at yoga teacher training, because it was a complete waste of intellectual time on my part. It was fun to think there was something special about it, but it wasn't until I dealt with a neuroscientist researcher many years later that gave me a book that actually explained the mechanics of like why that might be like actually like happening and what the relationship was to the shaman, et cetera, et cetera. So that was the mental structure for me to actually kind of address these earlier sensitivities that I think, like Lauren pointed out, a lot of people get stuck in that. And some of my spiritual teachers have said, yeah, as you start to develop, as you start to wake up more, you'll start to notice some of these sensitivities. And I would just liken that to what he's saying here, particularly the magic, even the mythic, but more in the archetype sense on the mythic, just sort of like these streams and these energy and these tensions and these narratives that are sort of like flowing through us. And just having a sensibility and a sensitivity to both our experience of that, our connection to each other, and then how we're making sense in a very rational world. So it's like still feeling impacted by all of this, aware of it, open enough to it to say, okay, yeah, all of these things are impacting how I'm interacting with the person in front of me, but I know they're relating to me in a purely concrete, sort of rational way. So how do I actually interact with them when I have a sensibility to what I need to say or do? And this book, for me, is just giving me a lot more structure around my internal orientation to the fact that these things are normal to be there, but it's also stressing me out a little bit because I can actually hold more and, I guess, accept more energy and, I guess, more responsibility and more discipline around the structure that I hold. So I feel like maybe you're already operating sort of in this a-perspective way, and so you already kind of have a sensitivity and a frame and an awareness to it, whereas like I feel like I kind of have a sensitivity, more of like an inclination towards it, but like it's actually physically painful for me to be going through and reading this book because it's actually causing me to grow in a way where I don't really pay attention to those sensitivities, but I just have to acknowledge that they're there. So I'm finding this to be fascinating. And even like this part to bring it back to the book where he's talking about art and he's talking about these artistic forms in the mythic and having like mastery and how certain artists can like share that and kind of invoke these experiences in us, because those tensions are naturally there, and having more intentionality around that. I don't know, like I think there's, for me, I feel very like raw and exposed right now because I have more sensitivity to it, but like I'm completely unable to really understand what's happening as a result of that. I mean, I feel very grounded, but it's also very painful at the same time. And so I think that's more of an indication for me developmentally where I'm at, and where this is stretching me to hold more and be more grounded at the same time. I don't know if any of that made any sense, but that's just kind of like where I'm struggling with this, not just intellectually, but for me, it's like I feel it like physically in my body, and it's uncomfortable, but also very enlightening, but it's kind of like hard to try and convey. But I'm glad I'm trying, it's just not, it's not comfortable, but I feel more sensitive.
That makes sense to me. It sounds like Di and Zach want to chime in too. Um, I'll just say really quickly, Kim, just because you asked. For me, you saw my Facebook post, the sort of I feel like my mind is kind of coming back to life kind of thing, and I have Gebser to thank/think for that. As just a play of words, because I feel the book itself, for me right now, seems to be like everything is coming into lucidity, or everything is becoming more crisp and clear, if that makes sense. There's a kind of clarity of things. It's almost like when you're doing meditation, and when you get out of meditation and all of your senses are just so vivid and almost tactile.
Yeah.
It's doing that to my thinking, to my feeling into the structures, and to just thinking about things and thinking about coming in contact with things going on in culture and music. It's almost like all of the senses are kind of coming together for me in a kind of very beautiful, lucid way. And Gebser talks about presence a lot in the book, and it's almost like the book itself for me is this kind of contemplative, lucidifying poem. It has a kind of like almost psychedelic effect in that sense, but in a very calm and clear, and just everything is becoming vivid, coming alive, including myself. I feel that in myself. So I've really been appreciating it, because I haven't read the book like this since I first got into Gebser, and I had that energy of its newness and the enthusiasm, and it was different. And this time it's every chapter, every page is intentional and is revisiting, and it's just so interesting. I feel very just clear, and maybe that's a perspective. I don't know, but I feel good. It feels clear. But Zach, you mentioned first you'd like to respond as well.
A lot was said, and I wanted to respond to the earlier, like just what it feels like for me. But I'm not sure if that's still completely relevant right now. Are you interested in hearing that, Kim?
Yeah,
or...
I am, definitely.
Okay. I mean, like, I don't know what integral means, and I don't really care if I am integral in a certain way. I used to care, because I used to like have like a attachment to it making me feel superior or something like that. And that's still there. Definitely, I can feel it in myself. That's like, it feels good to feel like I'm superior to other people, but it doesn't feel like that's all that's running me anymore, in terms of integral. And so I don't even tend to call myself integral anymore. This is somewhat of a digression, just saying that like all I do know is that the way I experience the world right now is different than the way I experienced the world 5 years ago, which is different than the way I experienced the world 10 years ago. And the difference seems to be that there's more of me in it, and there's more of the world in it. And whether or not that's integral and whether or not that stops anywhere, I don't know, and I don't really care in a certain way. And my experience of reading this book hasn't seemed to add more aspects to myself, but it's definitely seemed to stabilize and deepen things that are already there. I'm much more aware of like when I'm being influenced, or I have like language for it, right? Like I'm much more aware of like when I'm getting magically influenced. I'm like, oh, okay, that woman in front of me, her lipstick is like creating like this like emotional reaction inside me that's then making me in turn archetypal, like project an archetype onto her of like a sexual goddess or something. And like I'm much more aware of that whole process instead of just seeing sexual goddess. Oh my God. and also it's made me like, I do a lot of shadow work, and by shadow work I just mean that, like, looking for the stuff inside of me that I don't want to look at and intentionally looking at it. And in doing that this morning, I was finding that, like, there's like this part of me that resists doing shadow work, and that resistance I was identifying as myself. And now that resistance doesn't seem like myself anymore, and I can kind of like see the resistance and the shadow work I'm doing all as like one whole that's interacting with itself, instead of me being anywhere. So it feels like the whole process is more transparent in a certain way. And lastly, on that note, I just want to give one example. The other night I was at a poetry sort of reading that I was telling you all that I do, and I started speaking about capitalism in like a relatively conversational tone, and not instead of a debate sort of tone. And I was in a sleepy place, and I had forgotten that, like, a lot of people are really freaked out by capitalism, and you can't just have a conversation about it. And the group started, from my perception, kind of like ganging up on me, and then I ended up starting to bow out from being ganged up on, and also starting to both defend myself and bow out from being ganged up on. So I like don't want to be part of the conversation. And then through the rest of the night, I found myself feeling excluded from the group, and a need to like reintegrate myself by submitting myself to the various people that were like arguing with me, and like going and putting myself in a submissive posture and letting them know that I understand them, and please re-welcome me into like the circle of your love or whatever it is that I'm wanting. And all this is happening, but the thing that seems interesting and new from reading this book is that I'm not part of in all of this. Like, I'm like standing back watching all this happen without feeling like I am this person. Like somehow I'm like almost like looking from an outside perspective on it. And that's always been there to a certain extent. Or not always, but at least over like the last 5 years. But it's become like a lot more stabilized since reading this book. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that helps at all. But.
No, that's actually really helpful to hear you share that, because that's, I think, a much better kind of personal description, because I feel a lot, both like the panic and the chaos of being like energetically, just because I orient towards more of a kinesthetic synesthesia, where that's a sensory experience for me in my body that's a little disturbing. I'm used to it, but the clarity and the ability to interact and have more awareness in that. I was thinking today, because we did an app fabric upgrade on one of our servers yesterday, and it's like everything's working better. And I was like, oh, this is like a middleware upgrade. You know, that's kind of what this feels like to me when I read this book. It's like all the application processes that are running, you know, between these structures are actually communicating better. And I'm kind of growing into that, but it's causing me to interface externally and actually integrate some other work that I'm doing a lot more quickly. So it's ridiculous. Everyone around me is like, what the fuck happened to you? And because relatively, I mean, most people are pretty formulaic that I interact with. They're kind of not pushing themselves in these ways. So they're kind of like in their routine. So when I interact with them, like the trainer at the gym today or just someone I'm in conversation with, it's a lot more fluid and easy to just be very present. And not really think at all, but just to be present, feel if there's something to say or do it or not, and then do the next thing. And so this book for me has really just brought those kind of, like I said, the middleware, just that something in my brain or something in my mind or something, whatever. I mean, I can feel it also in my physical body, but I just feel like I'm operating a lot more efficiently with a lot, you know, I was kind of stuck on that whole intensity thing. He keeps talking about intensity throughout the book off and on. And I got really interested in that whole metabolization process of like extremes where you're kind of like, you know, I was thinking of Augustine and I always get accused of being intense, and since I've read this book, or started reading this book, people have shifted from "you're so fucking intense" to like, "wow, you seem really relaxed." So that's just like really direct feedback that I'm. And by the way, I haven't read. I caught back up today in the book, but I had to put it down for a few days because it was just like, whoa. But that's the shift for me, is like people are giving me the feedback that I just seem more relaxed, and I think that's because there is more integration happening. So it's exciting, but it's also kind of weird that just reading this book would do that. So I think caution, getting back to Marco's original kind of point, I think, yes, I think the caution is very well warranted, just from what I've experienced. Like I said, maybe you guys are a little bit further along, so this is sort of like, you've already been there, but for those of us that are, I think, had a lot of pieces floating around that needed to be connected, I think this book is definitely helping me do that, and it's awesome. So I'm just excited to be here and actually say this stuff out loud and not just keep it in my brain too. I always feel a little embarrassed after you get done with these calls, but I always grow from it. So.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, it's like a constant coming to awareness of these processes. Like, there's times when I find myself totally present, and I do think that rereading the book is helping me remember the language to use to describe these things, because I've found myself so often trying to describe what is going on, my experiences of this, to people who perhaps have not read the book and have no real experience with the integral discussion at all, and also getting kind of ganged up on and misunderstood mostly, and so the book, rereading the book is really helping me to get that language back to describe something to where it's like.
Can you give an example of a thing you would try and describe?
So I've been constantly having these battles with people about astrology, for example, and I'm not the kind of person that's going to sit here and say the planets are making this happen to me. I don't see astrology in that way. I see like it has a magical and mythical component to it, but it's not the only thing that exists. It's not like it's causal. Like in the mental world, we see things as being causal, and so there's also this like, well, we always had an ego. Even back when, in like magical times, we still had an ego because it was still like, I need to survive, right? And I'm like, yeah, well, of course we still had an ego, but it was a coming to awareness of our ego in the mental mutation that made it different, markedly different from the magical mutation, where we were not aware of an isolated sense of self that we would call an ego yet. And so again, it's helping me to remember my language in describing these things. Where
do you when you talk to those people about astrology, just as an example, right? So this is where, when I hear you say that, it feels like almost a rational structure to maybe have an argument or relate to those folks. And I noticed that there's some people that they're in their opening stage, and part of their opening stage is sort of, playing around with astrology or playing around with some of these magical, and just as a different way of thinking, and then kind of like moving that forward. My brother and I kind of joke about serendipity or synchronicity, and then we'll joke about it as a mental exercise to just be aware of that energy, and then we'll kind of move past it. But when we were doing this course, the lady kind of really had us get into that whole mindset. I think I'm appreciating one of my teachers early on from about 10 years ago, because she would let us go into these structures and play around with them a little bit, and then come out of them with a more rational relationship, but with an intuitive understanding, like I think Zach's saying, that they exist and people are experiencing them. Like whether it's Mercury in retrograde, I love to play with that one because people get all freaked out about it or whatever. But like having a sensibility to let them have that experience, as well as the capacity to maybe guide them through another way of being in relation to that, where it's not a power over, but it's a perspective to take. And so it's a sensibility of their experience and what they need, right? But then also like a guiding hand to kind of like make sure they're not stuck in la la land. I think that's, you know, I kind of get the sensitivity that you have that awareness.
Yeah.
Do you use it in that way? Because to me, that's the cat.
Yeah. Because, you know, like, I see that there's a lot of use in archetypal understanding. We've created meaning. We are creating meaning-creating beings, you know. Everything we do, we're trying to make meaning of it. And whether or not that even exists, whether it does, I mean, that part to me doesn't matter. What matters to me is that I see things that I can make connections with in my life and form meaning to me in a way that is giving me greater fulfillment and helping me see the world more transparently. Now, if it's making me stuck and pigeonholed in one particular idea, you know, as some people may be, oh, Mercury is causing this to happen, it's all fucking Mercury, like, and not taking responsibility for how I'm creating my world,
right?
Then we have a problem. Then we're, you know, not integrating these experiences, whereas, you know, like synchronicities as a child led me to what we're talking about right now. It led me to graduating from school and doing all sorts of things that I'm very proud of, you know, and just because I saw things that seemingly were random coincidences, but yet had meaning for me, right?
I'd like to just kind of bump in here real quick. We have actually a few questions in the Q&A box. I don't want to forget about them. But we have something from Karen McFarland, who's saying, she's asking, does Gebser ever discuss spiritual states as opposed to, say, affective states? It seems to me the states exist in of themselves, so can't be interpreted really within a mental narrative, for example. Anybody want to react to this? And I think you can open the Q&A box if you just, it's on the left-hand side if you want to take a look at the questions yourself. But yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I'd be curious what Karen means by affective states with an A, not effective, but affective.
I would guess maybe
states in psychology just usually refers to emotional states, in psychology at least.
Marco, are you going to say something?
basically what Zach just said.
Okay.
So is this maybe a question kind of along the pre-trans axis where, you know, spiritual is higher or more whole and affective is more just particular and emotional and mundane? I can't speak to this as what Gebser says or not, whether that's a you know, that's more of a scholarly question for somebody who's actually read more of Gebser. But I get the sense from this chapter particularly, and you know, as Gebser's talking about the numinosa and about the different experiences of soul, that they're really mixed together, and that it's more of a mental construction to separate out the spiritual from the affective. Like that's coming from the mental perspective, where we say that there are these different levels of being, and one is the emotional, one is the mental, one is the spiritual. But in these sort of primordial states that he's describing here, they seem to mix together, and there isn't just mere emotion, you know, and nor is there pure spirituality that would be distinguished from the content of our psyche, the content of our mythical, emotional, affective lives. By the way, I don't know if that's an answer exactly, but that would be my take on it.
Left a good comment. He says, Alan Combs makes a distinction between affective states, moods, and spiritual states, states of being. That's an interesting distinction. I like Alan Combs. Let's see, we got one more in the Q&A. And this one is from Donna, and it's just a quote. And I'm not sure when Donna, because she quotes Gebser saying, Quote, but here we encounter a remarkable fact. As the possibility diminishes for numinous experiences from nature, there is a proportionate increase of such experiences from art as created by man. I thought that was really interesting. The whole idea that the numinosity of nature withdraws, and as that numinosity withdraws, all of a sudden in civilization, that same kind of numinous experience happens with the kind of piece of artwork, whether it's sort of like modern art in like, a painting or a temple or something far more ancient or primordial like song and music. So that was really, an interesting thing. And I think Gebser mentions this a couple times, talking about sort of projection. And I don't know how everyone else understands this. Maybe I can throw this out there. This whole idea of projection, he talks about the ability to integrate things, the ability to kind of pull back the projections. And I know this is a very Jungian thing, but I don't know if that's what Gebser means by this, to kind of take back the projections in the world and sort of see them in ourselves. And he mentions this not in this chapter, but the chapter before this one, talking about, whatever we see out in the world, is first within us. And I thought that was kind of interesting as well. I'm not sure really if that's where John was going with that quote.
It's on 202 as well.
Yeah. I thought that was interesting. And
both of those ideas appear there in terms of like, basically mastery and being able to create works of art. Mastery of these structures, man is thus able to elicit the numinous effect, with an E, that resides primarily in the magic and mythic structures. And then he talks, above there, he talks about projection and the energizing of external objects, events, and actions by the dynamism of psychic energy inherent in man, ? I just thought this part was fascinating because I just get the sense that these forces are way more at play in our day-to-day. And I'm going to make kind of a crazy parallel. It keeps coming up to just kind of put out there, but reading earlier on in this book where Gebser talks about this theater, since we're talking about forms of art, and he talked about a performance where the one person was performing and everyone else had on a mask, but that, basically that individuation kind of away from the group. Does anyone else remember that earlier on in the reading? And what it reminded me of is Donald Trump deciding to break away from the pack and not go with the Republican the Republican debate. So he was kind of like that ego individuating itself from the pack. And it's interesting because I was like, oh, this is an interesting move, because from the book, I was like, I wonder if that's kind of what he's doing, is making a differentiation for that group, in such an extreme way. And I saw a parallel there, maybe, or maybe I just saw an association that wasn't really there, but I saw him pulling that move and how that kind of backfired on him, because I was like, no, actually, they're not really at the rational. Most Republicans are kind of at that mythic, and so he misread his audience by doing that extreme ego move and pulling himself away from the pack. But, for me, that's kind of a playful example in our day-to-day life where this reading has given me just a different lens even for that kind of political realm that we're dealing with right now, and where those people are at developmentally.
This is sort of in the realm of sort of the magical and occult studies and writings, but there's been a lot of interesting correlations. A few friends of mine, especially one, David Metcalf, he wrote an interesting article about how politicians utilize very sort of magical and occult techniques. This almost in a kind of primordial way it comes up, the use of language and of emotion and of will and symbolism to create a sense of purpose and meaning to kind of steer the crowd in certain directions. He has an interesting article sort of comparing politicians, fascists, and sort of like evangelical TV, and sort of seeing how they're all kind of connected in this sort of structural way. They're all sort of doing this kind of thing, and I think Gebser would probably find that to be related to his whole caution with the magical and the mythical in terms of their deficiency, especially with the rise of fascism in Europe. And he saw this firsthand with the use of media and music and this kind of thing, this kind of thinking. And in many ways, Trump is sort of doing the same thing. He's rousing emotions. He's getting people stirred. He's taking these very extreme stances, not really because, I mean, I don't know if he really believes any of these things, but the activity of taking these extreme stances and being so emotive and being so polarized, and being so alpha male, you know, just aggressive, and using this music and breaking away from the Republican Party to do his own thing, to me, it's all very indicative of that kind of structure kind of gone, in the negative sense, kind of gone awry. And somebody is using it, manipulating it to kind of maneuver people who are in a state of, you know, anxiety about the world, in which it always is a way to kind of to feel protected. You know, I think if we wanted to talk about politics and culture, it's not really in this chapter, but that's an interesting subject in itself, and how, you know, magic and mythical in their deficient forms are kind of ways for us to kind of regress into these coping strategies with terrorism, with, you know, political upheaval and economic stress. So, you know, 20th century is just such a great example of what can happen. But, you know, for me, one of the more recent connections I made with this chapter specifically, and this is just a smaller note, but they were talking, you know, Gebser's talking about the bird and the polarities of the soul. And, you know, David Bowie recently died. He actually died right when we started Nature of Origins. I believe it was the same day or just the night before. And his last song that came out that Friday was Lazarus. And the lyrics in Lazarus talk about, you know, he describes himself, and people think the song is sort of about his own meditation on his own death and his own life. And he describes himself as a bluebird. You know, he'll be free to fly like that bluebird. And as I was reading this chapter, I made the connection. Gebser's talking about the image of the bird as of the soul, or the ba, and you know, this idea that the bird takes flight from the body and that kind of thing. And here David Bowie is describing himself like, I'm going to be just like that bluebird, taking flight, being free. And sure, there's a kind of sentimentality to it, but then also you wonder, like, it's not just sentimentality. Maybe there's a connection to this kind of archaeology of the soul that we're discerning here in, you know, ancient Egyptian imagery. And also, you know, he mentions the image of the soul and the bird and these other types of winged animals, very common in sort of mythology. And sort of Campbell could probably talk to that a lot more. But I thought that was really interesting and kind of cool to see that just happening right here, you know, today. These things kind of pop up in us, even if we're not really making a conscious effort to say, like, oh yes, the soul represents, you know, the bird is representative of the soul, and I'm going to use that in my poem or my lyrics. It just kind of comes up spontaneously. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, Zach saying it allows us to connect with the meaning behind the cliche. I think that's true. You know, reading Gebser, you don't take any cliches lightly anymore. Turn of phrases and linguistic aspects to kind of connect and point to almost like in biology, where you learn about evolutionary biology and how your cells are made up of these other things and mitochondria. It's sort of like you kind of see this whole history that's sort of alive in you and the things you take for granted. But yeah, so we got about 10 minutes. Does anyone else want to kind of chime in about the bird and the soul, and or the polarities of the soul? Did anybody find this section? I mean, it was interesting, but did anybody glean anything from it that you want to note here?
He talks, I think it's in the chapter, he talks a lot about this idea of movement. Or there's a few mentions of this idea of movement and how that's inherent in the polarity aspect, and that's sort of the mythical. And so this idea of just the dynamism and the movement, and I think it kind of like weighs that, you know, differently than magical and then the rational. But I don't know. I just like this idea of just movement and how that that polarity piece keeps coming up. And I had a meeting yesterday with Bert Parlay. I think Marco, you know Bert, And I was telling him about our reading and my struggle with this, because Bert's really specializing in this polarity management language stuff, and I started struggling with polarity management, like in terms of the way that he's using it to have, more informed conversations. So this mention of polarity and kind of getting both an understanding of it as well as just a sense of what that feels like in the dynamism and the movement of it. I'm just wondering if anyone else kind of keyed in on that movement piece and that. I just like, because if these structures are always there, then that sort of tension is always there too, and how that really shows up in this chapter, but also just how your experience of that is, or how you make meaning of it.
I would like to respond to that, but I also know, we don't have that much time, and we haven't heard so much from Di or Peter or is it Nicholas? So I want to make sure I give you guys a chance to share anything that you might like to.
I could say I love the page 225, the winged dolphin, and the piece of text that goes with that. If I can find it again. Fish and wing, sea and flight, water and air. Close the circle of an unquestioning intermingling rhythm. I think that I've been kind of on the edge of the conversation that's been happening, and playing with the attribution of sense to senselessness out of my postgraduate research on autobiography, the stories we create, and the events we live in that aren't events that are recordable, but they are the ethos of who we are. And so I've just been playing with all that in my mind, and also recognizing terminology such as resistance and shadow work through the lens of my work in spiritual direction. So yeah, I don't think I have anything major to contribute at this point. I always find listening to these conversations helps me read the chapter rather than grabbing things from the chapter to be able to contribute. So somewhat of a passenger.
Where do you feel like you might be going with those thoughts? Because like the autobiography and the history, those I think really come together, right? Because they're part of a sort of mental telling of the story, or at one point he talks about recollecting, and then externalizing. So kind of gathering those pieces of a story together and then putting them into words, uttering them.
Yeah. Going back to the beginning of our conversation, I didn't mind the chapter seeming to go everywhere. I just felt overwhelmed by there is so much that I still don't know about all this, that I've never read about all this or seen in the primitive art or the ancient art, and I sense that the chapter is background for what's coming. So what you were saying, Marco, about it being the negative space without actually focusing on the sculpture itself. Yeah, I think you were taking me somewhere else, but
did you say you're teaching in a nursing home? Was that
No. I try to teach everyday philosophy, I'm calling it this year. Philosophy for daily living that integrates spirituality and sustainability. So what are we doing with the material universe, and how does that relate to our spirituality? And it's with a group of over 50-year-olds who sign up for regular conversations about it. It's not in a nursing home.
Oh, okay. And are you bringing in any of the book? Is it making its way into the discussions you're having?
Well, it will. I started the group with a philosophy for daily living using Wilbur, and we used integral life practice as our development of that in the second and third years. But I found it got far too personal for most of the participants, and so we wander everywhere now. But this year, my input will go to, well, actually, there's another way of looking at this, and here's Gebser's view, as much as I can grasp it, and as much as I can translate it to something every day for, you know, widows and wives of sick husbands and fascinating people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I would see the connection with autobiography there, because I mean, part of, you know, it seems like part of what a group like that might be doing is this recollecting and this sort of putting order to to the story.
Yeah, well, the fact is that every history is a history through somebody's lens. There isn't an objective thing called history. There is a history of almost everything. But the same with autobiography. It is what story you are creating, what story you are building, what structures you are, and then when those previous structures collapse through some trigger experience or traumatic event, you're reconstructing the story. And so it's, yeah, I don't know. It kind of feels like it's on the edges, but the attribution of sense to senselessness was one of the key phrases for me.
I appreciate that too, Dai. You mentioned that also in the comments about making sense of a common series of events and non-events, and this whole idea that, you know, so many of our history books make these significant points. They create these significant points in history. Well, this is where history happened, but there's other places where history happened.
He talks about particles of time. Dates as being the particles of time.
Yeah.
It's like this atomistic kind of thing. But then about, I mean, this recollecting, I don't have it in front of me, but he talks about that, I think, as part of what consciousness does. Like, consciousness is not limited to any of these particular structures. And it mutates through those and experiences, you know, reality through those, but is not limited to those. And that was one of the really interesting points. It's on page 204, where he describes consciousness as the intensity capable of integrating the mutations in their entirety. And that certainly, I think, would include the histories and you know, and the transition points, or the points where things kind of break down and something new occurs. It's happening within consciousness still. Anyway, yeah. Peter, do you have any reflections?
David White's a poet that I met a few years ago online, and he has a TED Talk called The Conversational Nature of Reality, and basically the idea is all you have to do is be in the conversation, and the conversation does the work. I think that's happening to me. It's just amazing to me. I've read through this whole stuff twice, and I feel like I've absorbed a lot, but I don't know what it is. I can't seem to talk like some of you guys do in such great details about this. But it has an impact on me, and I'll just share what happened this morning. I wasn't going to share this, but a couple other people talked about how the whole thing is working on them. But how it's working on me was this morning, during my meditation, I started thinking about sin and how that was such a huge issue for me when I was a young child. And I had a really hard time, even when I wasn't challenging anything in the Catholic Church, I had a really hard time with the whole notion of original sin, because I strove mightily as a young kid to avoid sin. And here they're telling me that I'm a sinner. That was like intolerable for me to hear. So I started thinking about that. And a long time ago, I heard that the word sin was from a Greek word, hamartia, or something, means an archery term to miss the mark. And so I went online and I tried to find some more about it. And I found an article that it's the same idea as in Hebrew. The missing the mark. And I don't know, I just had an experience of hearing about origin, and I'm saying, like, okay, the ever-present origin, and suddenly the whole possibility of that just became very present to me. And I'm thinking, like, how can you put these two together? And that I thought that we're born into a state where we're not aware that there is an origin. And all of a sudden I started breaking the word original sin, original, break off the AL at the end, and origins right there in the word. So original sin is not being aware of the origin being ever present, and that to grow into a fully integrated human being is to practice bringing into being the presence of origin in our life. And when I kind of put all that together, Marco, you were saying earlier that you were taken with that sentence when you talked about the possibility of an apsychic world. All of a sudden I had an aha moment, and I could feel it in me that the apsychic, in the sense of being free from the psychic, was possible. And to be honest with you, I think the way my life has gone, I feel like I'm in the grips of this psychic thing, and 9 years of holotropic breath work, and I don't feel I'm getting in that far with it, and yet in a moment I had the possibility of this apsychic world. So that was my personal experience this morning.
That's a pretty radical notion, Peter. An apsychic world is potentially available to us. I don't know, I just find this to be very powerful. It sort of doesn't orient us back towards myth or the soul. It says there's something else to reality, and it's not just the waking, conscious, mental mind either. Just, it's kind of saying neither of these things, not this or that. And it's very liberating for me. But I guess we're at the end of the session here. There's a little bit of echo.
Let me see. I'd love to hear from Nicholas if you have any reflections yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a minute, sure. This is I've only done this is only my second Hangout ever. First one being the other week with you guys. I'm still learning how it sort of works. I read this book some years ago and came away with an intuitive sense that this guy was sort of a giving and an impressive spirit in his own way. I skimmed over the chapters that you were discussing today, these chapters 5 and 6, and frankly, it reminded me of my frustration when I was reading the book the first time. With it's tremendous erudition, but it's also sort of jumping wildly, as it seemed to me, over so many topics that I prefer things to be orderly, and my temptation is to want to really focus in on a question, like what exactly does aperspectival mean, and have a real hands-on discussion about that. I don't know if this is the right forum for that at all. Just to offer one little comment that I don't know might be interesting, although I know we're really out of time to bat it around any. But these chapters in particular, Gebser is, of course, a tremendously erudite guy from this whole European tradition with wealths of references, many of which are obscure to most of us. It was peculiar to me that on some of these topics, though, he seems to omit maybe some of the better known or more traditional references. He's talking about the spatialization of consciousness, and he talks about Oswald Spengler and people like that, and I would have thought Bergson would have been the obvious person to talk about, and he doesn't. And he talks about the plurality of souls, and he kind of skips Plotinus. So I don't know, just sort of an interest, one little comment there that his choice of references are ample, but they sort of leave out some things too. I don't know if that's a very useful closing comment, but you asked, so there it is.
I thought similar. In this chapter, for example, there's a couple places where I thought he could have been talking about Nietzsche when he talks about this animating force, or he talks about the mana, the will to power. He almost goes so far as to describe it in very, very close terms to how Nietzsche would have, and he surely, I think, would have had read Nietzsche at this point. So that's one potential omission I noticed. He also like just the ideas of space and time. That's really comes into a philosophical expression in Kant. The Critique of Pure Reason is, the first part of that is all about space and time, and I read this many years ago in a college class, so I couldn't really speak about it that much in detail, but that would be like one of the elephants in the room philosophically in terms of who he's responding to. He seems to have a very particular, I don't know, it's like he's taken a very particular path, and that's why so many of the references are obscure, perhaps. Heidegger comes up in the previous chapter as well, and what he calls the dead end of being in time, because it comes to a certain conception of time, which kind of in Heidegger reverts back to a sort of mysticism and sort of mythological aspect. Heidegger didn't recognize this newly emergent consciousness that Gebser does here. So I appreciate your comments, Nick, and I think that there's a lot in this chapter that we can get very detailed about. And we almost might need to just sit down and like read it live, and interpret it point by point. When I read Kant for the first time, the professor had us read the book in class, and we went through it line by line. And wherever anybody got stuck or had a question, we went into it, and it was excruciatingly slow. It's tough, but it feels like you get a lot out of it because you focus in so intensely. And maybe one of the themes that to kind of tie some different points together that people have brought up in terms of the effect of the book, there may be. I think there is an effect of just the act of reading, like the act of reading carefully, the act of reading slowly, the act of sort of following very detailed and nuanced thoughts. Like it has itself a psychoactive effect, and we perhaps, unless you read a lot of philosophy, there's I know a few people who read philosophy intensely and who are very who've been doing that for many years, are very studious. But if you don't, and then you come into a text like this, and you engage it, you really kind of like get into it, then I think just that act, regardless of whether you even understand all the details and all the specific relations between the poles of the soul and so forth, just that act has some effect, has some effectiveness in our own psyches. I mean, like Peter's glimpse of an apsychic reality. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that happens just because we're kind of lasering in and bringing our collective energies, our mana. That's another word that comes here. Like we're in a sense like we're investing mana into this reading, into the experience of reading together, into these hangouts, into these discussions, and that mana it has a potency to it. It has a spiritual energy that causes things to happen, and I think that's why it was interesting to hear how everybody has been like reacting to it, because here we are, we're 4 weeks in, so we've been doing this for about a month. We're gonna, on our schedule, we're gonna take a week off and catch up, so there'll be sort of a moment to breathe. But it's like we've made something happen, right? He talks about making something happen versus letting things happen, and the wisdom of being able to navigate those. And I think the act of reading together, the act of talking about it, people on this call have come back again and again, so we've started to sort of form this morphogenetic kind of groove. We're actually kind of digging something into the to the field, the spiritual field. And then we affect each other, right? That's part of the magic and the psychic aspect of it as well. Yeah, I think we can go further in that direction. That's definitely an interesting way to go. But I also want to respect the time that we're at, and not get too submerged in these particular waters.
I just want to quickly mention, Di brought up a great point, just to wrap up. I mean, she says, I'm always glad when there's a reference to non-Western contexts. We have heaps to learn here. And Gebser, he was a self-learned guy. He didn't go get his doctorate. He didn't learn all of this stuff, in the kind of canon sort of way. He kind of self-taught. So he has a kind of eccentric way of organizing all of this knowledge. I think it's important to keep in mind that his personality is also in the book, and sometimes it might confuse us. Anyway, so thanks for mentioning that, Di. I appreciate it. The eccentric poets kind of organizing reality in their own way, their own histories, right? But thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and I don't think we decided whether or not we're going to do a hangout next week.
I think we should take a break.
Okay.
I think we need it. I think we need to kind of recollect and process it a little bit. Maybe let's talk about it tomorrow, Jeremy. Maybe one, but sort of on a different topic. Yeah. Maybe we can just kind of do an excursus and then come back to part 2.
Maybe over the weekend. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm excited for part 2.
Oh yeah, this is where it's going to get really.
I think we've sort of, what's the word? We've done our home. We're doing our homework now. I think part 2 is going to be about like harvesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. We'll see.
We're going to take off. I'll tell you that. All right. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
And enjoy the week off and enjoy catching up. And we'll see you on the forums.
Bye.
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 Hey.
Bye.
Bye, Di. Bye, Lauren.
Bye.
Bye, Natalie.